Hey everyone, today I'm covering the basics of navigating with airplanes that have more traditional steam gauges in Microsoft Flight Simulator. This was requested by a subscriber, Mario Perron, who I'm guessing might be from my neck of the woods from reading his name. The majority of airplanes that come with Flight Sim have what you'd call a glass cockpit, where everything is integrated into the LCD displays in the cockpit. There are a few airplanes though that still have more traditional gauges like the Cessna 152, the Cessna 172 in the premium edition with the steam gauges, as well as one of the Robin aircraft as well. The gauges in these planes resemble more what you would have seen in all airplanes that are over around 10 to 15 years before the digital age really took over in aviation. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but depending on the airplane and the equipment that's installed on board, you might not be able to do certain things that you can do with an airplane that has the integrated GPS in the digital displays. There are also a lot of airplanes on the marketplace that you could buy with more traditional gauges, such as Aerosoft's Piper Arrow or PMDG's DC-6. For that reason, it's a good idea to at least familiarize yourself with them, because if you want to move to those types of airplanes, you're going to have to be familiar with how all of the instruments work in those planes. For this video, I'm going to use the Cessna 152 since that's one that everyone is going to have, and you can do a fair bit with it, even though there are some limitations, and I'll talk about those during the video. You'll get the most value out of this video if you're already somewhat familiar with flying airplanes in Flight Sim, and you're somewhat familiar with the basics of navigations in the glass cockpit airplanes, which I've covered in previous videos if you want to have a look at that. Alright, with all of that said, let's start by planning a short flight that I can use to demonstrate the capabilities of the traditional gauges, and then we're going to jump into the cockpit and explain how to actually use the instruments. I've put together a relatively short flight plan from east of Indianapolis, west to the satellite city of Terre Haute. As usual, I did a lot of the research for my flight plan on skyvector.com. It's a simple interface that gets me just that little bit more information than I can get from the flight planning screen. The most useful part is the different airways that are shown in black between the different VORs. I hope they make it possible to view these airways in the flight planning screen in the future, since I'm pretty sure they used to be there in the old days of FSX. I could technically fly directly from the Brickyard VOR over to the Terre Haute VOR. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to fly along the V192 airway from the Brickyard VOR, and that's going to require me to change course about halfway to the Terre Haute VOR. Now, one thing the Cessna doesn't have is distance measuring equipment, or DME, that can tell me the distance to or from a VOR. That means I can't simply just look at how far it is from the Brickyard VOR to that intersection point. I'll have to do it another way, and I'm going to look at that in the video. The other thing that I need to keep in mind is the distance between the VORs. It's not a problem in this case since I'm traveling a relatively short distance, 56 nautical miles between the two airports. But if I were flying a longer flight, I need to make sure that I can capture the signal of the VORs. After I've departed one, I need to make sure that I can capture the next one along my route. Otherwise, I won't really have any way to navigate since the Cessna 152 doesn't have a GPS. That's a really key, important piece of information that you need to keep in mind when you're planning a flight with an airplane that doesn't have a GPS and only has traditional gauges. Each VOR is classified as either a terminal, low altitude, or high altitude VOR. Terminal VORs are designed to receive a signal from around 25 nautical miles, low altitude VORs for a distance of up to 40 nautical miles, and high altitude VORs are around 130 nautical miles. Luckily for me, both VORs that I'm using are going to be high altitude, and I won't have any problems capturing the signal along any part of my route. On top of that, you have to remember that you need line of sight to get a signal from a VOR. If there's a mountain between you and the VOR station, you won't be able to get a signal even if you're in range. The last thing I want to point out before I get into the cockpit is that the flight plan in this case isn't strictly necessary since it won't appear on a GPS screen anywhere. It'll still be shown on the VFR map if you get completely lost and you want to find where you are though. I keep it as a measure of last resort though, because it sort of takes away from the immersion of having to fly the airplane with traditional gauges. Alright, with that covered, I'm going to launch the flight. I'm on the ramp with the plane started up just to go over a few details before I taxi to the runway. The most obvious difference with a lot of the airplanes in Flight Sim is that instead of the giant glass LCD displays, I've got a bunch of mechanical gauges. The main 6 instruments that you use for flying, so the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, the altitude indicator, the vertical speed, the compass, as well as the turn coordinator, are only on the left-hand side of this cockpit because it's a much smaller airplane than I'm normally flying. I'm not going to focus too much on those instruments for this video. I'm really going to look at the navigation stack that's right here, as well as the two VOR gauges that allow me to capture the signal from two separate VORs at the same time. The gauges have a much more analog feel to them, and you can feel that the airplane is definitely a lot older than what a lot of the other airplanes in Flight Sim look like. Just like in the previous video I did on VOR navigation, you tune the standby frequency by turning the outer and inner knobs that are just below it. The outer larger knob is going to change the number that's to the left of the decimal point, and the smaller inner knob is going to change the numbers on the right hand side of the decimal point. Depending on the direction you turn the knob, it's either going to increase the number or decrease the number, so just figure out which way is closest to what frequency you're looking for and start turning that way. Once you've got the frequency that you want, you can make it the active frequency exactly like we did in the glass cockpit by pressing the arrows right here, and that's going to switch the frequencies. And now instead of using the 110.5, we're now using the 116.3 frequency for the nav1 radio. You'll notice that since I'm already picking up the station, that the nav light right here turned green to indicate that I'm capturing a signal. Now all that's left for me to do is to turn the course to the course that I want to fly outbound from the Brickyard VOR, which is going to be 229. I do that by turning the OBS knob right here, and as I'm turning it, you can see that the little arrow changed from a from to a to indicate that I am now going to be flying to the station. I won't cover what that means again in this video. If you are wondering what that is, please make sure to go back and check the VOR navigation video. One thing to note, because this isn't a digital display like in the glass cockpit, I don't have an exact reading on the course that I'm actually on. Whereas in the glass cockpit, it would have said the course right now is 229. In that sense, you have to be a little bit more approximate than you would in the glass cockpits, but in most cases, it's going to be more than sufficient. While I'm here, I am also going to tune the VOR2 frequency, which in this case is going to be 115.3. So again, I just turn the knob to get to the number that I want to on the standby frequency. Once I've got it, I hit the arrow and it's going to switch it to the primary frequency. Now you'll notice that there's no indication to tell me that I'm actually capturing a signal from this VOR at the moment. That means I'll have to get airborne, and probably at that point I'll start picking it up a few minutes into my flight because it is a high frequency VOR. Alright, with all of that set, I am ready to get going, so I will probably join you just as I'm taking off, since there isn't really much to see between here and the time that I actually taxi to the runway, which is conveniently right here. Just before I get going here, I do want to remind you, if you do get some value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. And I apologize for my voice for the last part of this video. Between the time I started recording it and the time I ended it, I caught a pretty bad cold, so you'll have to bear with my slightly deeper voice. Alright, I'm just getting underway, and the first thing I'm going to do once I'm airborne is I'm going to turn around 30 to 45 degrees to the right of heading 229 to get a little bit closer to the radial that I want to fly. You can see the needle is fully deflected to the right, which means that the course that I want to fly is somewhere to the right. Right now I'm heading to the station, but in a few minutes it's going to flip to flying from the station. But because I have no distance measuring equipment or GPS, it's really hard to tell when exactly that's going to be. I know from the flight planning section that it's only a couple of nautical miles to the station, so I won't chase the needle too much, and it's really not that big of a deal since I want to fly the same radial to and from the station. So I'll just continue on this course until I intercept it, and the needle in Nav1 starts centering itself. Whether that's while I'm still flying to the station or from the station, it doesn't really matter. While I'm flying to the station, there's a few more details about the mechanical gauges that I wanted to cover. One difference with the glass cockpit is that once you set the frequency, you'd actually see the identifier appear for it in the digital display, so you know you have the right station dialed in. But with the more traditional gauges, you don't really have that option. All you get is a green nav light which tells you you're picking up the signal, but you don't know what station it's picking up. In theory, it's the right one, but it could potentially be something else. To make sure you're on the right station, you have to press the appropriate nav button at the top of the control panel. In this case, let's say nav 1, and then you'll start hearing a Morse code over the radio. That Morse code is the 3-letter identifier of the VOR, which you can also see on SkyVector. In this case, it's the letters V, H, and P, which matches the code of the station. You can adjust how loud the Morse code signal is by turning the knob right here, either up or down. I find it a bit low even at its highest, so I tend to leave it at the topmost point. Another difference between the VOR gauge in the glass cockpit and the traditional gauges is the little notches that indicate how far off course you are. In the glass cockpit, there are 2 dots on either side, and each dot represents 5 degrees of deflection. But in a gauge like this one, each dot represents 2 degrees, up to 10 degrees of deflection as well. So it's representing the same range and the same amount of deflection, but it's just a little bit more precise, ironically, since you can tell a little bit better how far off course you are. Alright, you can see that the indicators switch from saying to from inside of the gauge, which means I've now gone past the VOR, and the course of 229 is starting to come in a bit as well. So I'm going to start turning more towards the right heading that I need to be flying to intercept the 229 radial. I'll just keep making small changes to get myself directly on the course to center the needle. If the needle is to the right, I need to turn more to the right. If the needle is to the left, I need to turn more to the left. You can see I overcompensated here, and the course is still a little bit to the right, so I'm just going to make a small adjustment here to fix that. The Cessna 152 doesn't have an autopilot, so I've got to do all of this by hand, but it's a nice little challenge from just letting the autopilot do everything for you. There's a bit of wind blowing from the west as well, so I need to keep that in mind to adjust my heading accordingly. I'll probably have to fly a little bit to the right of the course to stay on track without having to make constant adjustments to my heading. I've got some time until I get to the intersection point where I need to change course, but I'm going to start setting that up now. Now, if I had a way to measure the distance to or from a station with a GPS or DME, I could just look at the distances on the map, and once I was at the right distance, I could change course, or when I see I'm over that intersection point that we're using to turn at, I could do it as well. But even without knowing that, I can still get to my destination on course using just these traditional gauges. That's where having the second gauge is going to come in pretty useful. You'll recall I tuned it to the right frequency before takeoff, and the little green indicator has turned on to tell me that I'm capturing a signal from it. You'll recall from the flight planning section that the course that I need to fly to the Terre Haute VOR is a 257 radial. Right now it's set to due north, so I'm going to have to change that. I calculated that by seeing that the radial from the station to the intersection point is 077, so I added 180 degrees to that number since I want to fly to the station rather than from it. If I were to set the OBS to 077, you'd see that the arrow would say I'm flying from, but by putting it to 257, it's going to say that I'm flying to the station. Once again, I'll turn the OBS knob to the right course of 257, which again is a little bit of an estimate because those numbers aren't precisely written on this type of gauge. Now to stay on course, all I've got to do is fly the 229 radial from the Brickyard VOR on nav 1. And once the needle on nav 2 starts to center itself, I can turn to 257 since that's the intersection point to fly to the Terre Haute VOR. I really find flying like this to be a lot of fun. It's a little bit old school, but it tends to immerse you a little bit more into the game, and I really enjoy that. Alright, I'm coming up on the 257 radial now, and you can see that the needle on VOR2 is starting to center itself as well. As it gets to within 2 to 4 degrees, that's where I'm going to start turning towards my new course of 257. That's the heading I'm going to have to follow from here all the way to the VOR and then on to the airport. Once I've actually intercepted the radial, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the VOR1 frequency to use the Terre Haute VOR, and I'll stop using nav2. VOR1's just that little bit easier to see at the top of the gauges, so having it on nav1 once I don't need the Brickyard VOR anymore makes a lot of sense. And just like that, without a map, a GPS, or DME, I was able to find my way from one airport to the other. It's obviously a bit more challenging than doing it with a giant GPS display in your face, but the challenge is a lot of fun, and it keeps me a lot more engaged in my flight, and I really enjoy doing these types of things. Now, there are a few other things you can do as well on top of navigating without a map. You can also fly some non-precision approaches too. A lot of the VOR and localizer approaches don't require any other type of instrument on board. I'll probably make a follow-up video covering how to fly a VOR approach without DME. Since you need to calculate the distance that you've traveled by time, it's a little bit more of a challenge as well, but it's a whole lot of fun too. As usual, I hope you learned something useful for your next flight, and if you got some value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.